Hi guys, my name is Shane Cuthbert and welcome back to lesson 20 of the Change Your Life course. So we're really getting towards the end now. We're really learning a lot. These lessons are jam-packed with heaps of stuff. So I really hope that, they're making a difference to you in your own life. But just remember, if you haven't reached that outcome yet, we're not done and we're rewarding the steps, okay? So, you've really just got to congratulate yourself for being here now. What we're going to talk about in this lesson is the reals and the feels. Okay, now I've got a book, actually online at the moment. It's called The Reals, the Feels and the Ideals, where I really go into depth talking about this stuff, but I've, crunched it down and tried to fit it into, a short lesson for you guys to put into this series. By all means, if you want to, think about some of the things we've shared in this lesson a little bit deeper, grab yourself that book. It's a great read, but I've really tried to condense it and make it easier for you guys to learn, obviously, with the cartoons and stuff like that makes it easier to sort of visualize what I'm talking about. So welcome to lesson 20, the reals and the feels. In the last lesson, we learned that fundamentally, when we look at any problem, so any person with any problem, fundamentally at the core, you're going to see that black and white thinking is a part of that problem, okay? So their black and white beliefs and values are what's keeping all of those people stuck, and that's what makes it so hard for us to change moving forward. Our inner, more primitive part of the brain does really, really well. So what we really want to know here is, how do we strengthen those outside parts of the brain, okay? The parts that allows us to compartmentalize what's going on, to break down the steps, that awareness. How do we make that stronger? How do we make our weaknesses a little bit stronger? In this lesson, I'm going to explain how exactly we respond back to those black and white thoughts. Because that's what we need to do to get those things that we want to do on our inner child's list of cans. But most importantly, that's what we need to do for them to stay there, to keep them on that list, to really have that identity change so that our change is long lasting. It's what we want to do to condition ourselves so that we're just magnetically drawn towards those new behaviors, and we have those new beliefs and those new values that are going to keep pushing us forward, and they're going to take us in the right direction. Instead of falling into those old patterns, going round the roundabout and falling off the wagon, I'm going to tell you the secret to happiness. Now, happiness isn't just about looking at the glass half full. If you do that and you keep looking at the glass as being half full, you're going to keep living in a life of denial. Now, we've spoken about the difference between the positive and negative minded person before, and how really neither of those views are beneficial, okay? We really want to find somewhere in the middle to sort of, have our perception, acknowledge what's going on. We want to see the glass as it is, not half empty or half full. We just want to see things as they are. Happiness comes from our ability to be able to zoom out and see the full cup. Okay, happiness comes from having the ability to see things as they are. And that includes being grateful for the part of the glass that is, half full, that part that's full, but being realistic and recognizing the part that's empty, accepting the parts that are beyond our control, and focusing on changing those parts that are within our control, those things that we can change. So when we start to look at that half-empty glass, when we start to look into the dark space, or once we fall down on those stairs, what do we tell ourselves specifically? To be able to get back up, or to be able to create light where there is none, okay? So to get out of the darkness, what do we say to ourselves? I'm going to give you another example, but I'd like you to remember that each time I get you to look at an example, I want you to look for the recurring patterns that are personally relevant to you, okay? So you're going to relate it to yourself and you're going to look for the patterns, okay, in these examples. the things that you're doing relative to that. The difference between learning something, really, really fast or learning something slowly is about being able to recognize the patterns, okay? To recognize the things that are recurring. Most people go through life being distracted by the variables and they don't see the constants. People only see the things that are different to them and not the things that are the same, the things that are similar. For example, when I was talking to you about how a parent might calm, a baby, with a bottle or a rattle, trying to neglect it or shutting out the screaming, giving the baby to somebody else. That's important because as adults, we do a similar thing, okay? We do the same thing. We distract ourselves. The way that we deal with, those uncomfortable emotions is we usually just try to distract ourselves with something. We try to suppress it or bury it. We put a dummy in its mouth. Giving out feelings sort of to someone else is a bit like finding yourself in a codependent relationship. You're taking all that baggage and you're expecting somebody else to take care of it for you. Now that's the recurring pattern. We do the same thing, we just do it in different ways. Moving forward, I want you to look for the patterns, look for the recurring patterns, okay, the things that are significant to you, the things that you're going to relate to. Instead of just giving you all of this knowledge and theory, the really powerful thing and, the best thing for me to do is to be able to actually change what you see, to change what you notice, so that after you finish these lessons and you go out, into the wide world out there, you start to notice these patterns and see these things. Okay, the biggest thing I can really do for you is really get you to a point where you start noticing these things yourself. Okay, that your awareness has really grown throughout these lessons. Here's an example of black and white thinking getting in the way in a real life therapeutic situation. Okay, so you've got a husband and wife attending therapy. Before they decided to come along to therapy, they were blind to the specific problems that they were having. They were in denial about it and they were keeping them in the dark. By the time someone eventually comes to therapy, they've already started to sort of acknowledge that there's a dark space, okay? That things aren't so perfect. See, if things are perfect, you don't go to therapy. Fair enough. So let's say you've got this couple that comes along to therapy. They sit down and they start talking about the issues, in their marriage or in their life. Where do you think they're going to start? Funny enough, it usually starts with everything's fine. It's all okay. It's all wonderful. But once you start to venture into that dark space, the predictable pattern is to start finger pointing. We naturally start pointing the finger of blame at the other person. We're blaming the other person as being responsible for our own problems. The wife might say, he withholds emotionally. He withholds emotionally to punish me. He says, she's always provoking me. She's always, poking me, trying to get a reaction out of me. She might say, he's never open and honest about what's going on. He doesn't talk to me. And the husband says, when I do try to be open and honest, she puts me down. She doesn't like it. She doesn't like the honesty. She says, well, he never tells me what's going on. He hides everything. I never know where I stand. He says, yeah, because every time I tell her, what's going on, she just overreacts. She makes it bigger than it needs to be. It's always a drama. I'd rather just avoid it. She might say something like, when we get together with our friends, he cares more about them and what they think than me. He thinks, she really, she's always controlling who I hang out with. If she doesn't like this person, I can't hang out with them. If that person says something negative, I can't hang out with them. She says he's quick to react. He's got a temper. He goes off easily. I don't have to say much and he just starts going off. He says, well, she's always just trying to get under my skin. She's just playing games. She's just trying to get that reaction from me. She wants me to go crazy. She's playing the victim. He only wants me when it's convenient for him. He only wants to spend time with me, when his friends are busy. He might say, she uses intimacy as a bargaining chip. I've got to beg for it. So once as a therapist, we step in there and we try to, get these two people to stop the finger pointing and redirect the attention to what each individual can change about themselves. Okay, because remember, we can't change other people. The same pattern is fairly predictable still. These people begin by saying, "Oh, there's no problem with me. No, I've got no problems. I'm fine. I'm good. It's her." She's saying, No, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just him. If he stopped doing that thing, everything would be great. Remember, we talked about this in one of the first lessons when it comes to change and changing our environment. We can't change other people. We can't change our environment. We can sit there and say, "Oh, look, if this person stopped doing that thing, life would be great." But in reality, we can't change that person. Sometimes what happens when these couples do couple therapy, that's what they're expecting. They think that they can convince the therapist that something is wrong with the partner, tell the partner that something's, wrong with them. So confirm our own beliefs, basically. Okay, we might say, look, our partner does this, our partner does that. We want to get the therapist to say, "Oh, yes, no, he does," or yeah, she does do that. So we can say, "Aha, see, I told you. Now you have to fix your problem, and so everything can be good again and I don't have to do anything." The reality of the situation is that's not how it works. That's not how we change. Once you go a little bit deeper into the darker space, that sort of begins the problem of, okay, yep, I do that. That's because my ex did this to me. Or in a past relationship, I was damaged, due to a bad relationship. Or once you, get into an even darker space, the problem then becomes, I do that problem because, at school, this mean teacher, said something mean to me, or did something to me, or at home, my family was like this, or, my parents were like that. Now, while, in truth, perfectly honestly, yes, all those things may have contributed to our conditioning and who we are and why we're doing that problem. It may be because of our parents or an ex-partner. That's true. That's not necessarily, not true. But the thing is that we can't control our past, okay? We can only control our future. So yes, we can say that, we have been acting this way up until this point because of our past, but now we are acknowledging and we are aware of our past. We don't have to allow that past to decide who we're going to be in our future. We don't have to take that past and bring it into our new relationship. We don't have to take that bad relationship we had in the past with someone and, attack our new partner for it. That's not their fault. That's not their problem. And you might have a really understanding partner that, is very patient with you and says, I understand you had a terrible partner. But just because they sympathize with you, it doesn't mean that it's okay. What you're doing, if you're having a loving relationship, you really love this person, what you're doing is wrong. You can't take your past into the future. We can't control the past. We can only control what we do now. Remember in one of the previous lessons, I said that basically what happens is we generally take sort of being responsible for something. Okay, so accepting responsibility and saying, yep, I'm responsible for that thing. We unconsciously take that as a negative thing. That we sort of feel like, we sort of view responsibility as, accepting blame for stuff. Okay? So the hurdle moving forward, to get over all of those sort of things and acknowledge all those things within ourselves and take responsibility is to acknowledge that feeling of defensiveness and move past it. Stop feeling like we're under attack or that someone's blaming us. In order to protect ourselves from those feelings, okay, those negative feelings, our instinct and the first sort of thing we come to is we naturally just start pointing the finger at somebody else. We start blaming other people for our problems or our situation. We start pointing fingers at things that are beyond our control. It's that person's fault, it's our environment's fault. That doesn't get us anywhere. Once a person starts to get deeper into the dark space, when there's nobody else around for them to, point the finger at, that's when quite often that overwhelming feeling of negative and suppressed emotions just come over us. It starts to pour in. And our initial sort of feeling and reaction is to become overwhelmed. In this moment, when we become overwhelmed, all those feelings, all those things that have been hiding in the dark space really come out. We break down. We're telling ourselves and everyone around us, we're not good enough. Where, terrible things happened to us as a child and, we can't change and this happened and I feel worthless and I can't do this and I'm struggling. We break down and that's, when we cry, it's when we get really, really upset and we think, we can't do this anymore. We can't cope. We become suicidal. We become riddled with anxiety. We get overwhelmed with these feelings that just really break us down and we see and feel like there's no way that we're going to be able to break free and move out of that space again. We become completely overwhelmed. And it's negative. We say these negative things about ourselves. But when we zoom out and start to look at the parts of the glass that are half empty and come to an acceptance about the things that are beyond our control, once we start to venture into that space, it becomes extremely important to learn how to examine those more uncomfortable elements of our reality and use rational thinking. In other words, what we really need to do is we need to learn how to separate the reals from the feels. So we might feel overwhelmed, we might feel like that glass is half empty, but we need to separate that from the reality, which is the glass is as it is. It's both half full and half empty. That's what we need to do. We need to separate the reals from the feels. We almost need to step outside of ourselves and look at the situation without feeling about that particular situation, okay? It's about thinking rationally, about using our logic and those outside parts of the mind that we've talked about in previous lessons. What is reality and what isn't? Now, reality is that there may have been things at a younger age that conditioned us to have certain problems. And maybe that feels like, we could never change. But that's just a feeling. The reality may be that everything isn't actually hunky-dory. That might be the reality, as hard as that is to accept. The reality is that there are problems. Of course there are. Sometimes those problems are really serious and they need to be addressed. But does that mean that we are totally worthless? Or that we should feel ashamed? Does that mean we should feel guilty? Helpless? Or hopeless? No. That's not reality. It may feel that way. But that's just a feeling. Just remember that that's not reality. That's just a feeling. The reality and the feeling need to be separated in order to move, deeper and further into that dark space, but to go there and accept the things that are beyond our control. When we can do that, the dark space tends to get smaller, okay? And we let a little bit more light in. Now, this might sound really simple, but if we're going to understand, the difference between the reality, sort of the reals and the feels, we're going to have to learn how to understand, the difference in the relationship between our thoughts and our feelings. Because just as the reals, the reality of a situation is different to what we're feeling, so too are, our thoughts and feelings. It's important to understand the relationship between thoughts and feelings and not to mistake the two. In the next lesson, I'm going to help you become better able at recognizing when you're in that cycle of, thoughts and feelings, and your feelings controlling your thoughts and your thoughts controlling your feelings. Get into that cycle and pinpoint those exact moments when you can step in and you can really separate the two, because that's what we need to do. We need to separate the reals from the feels, just like we need to separate our feelings from our thoughts. In this lesson, you saw a classic example of how black and white thinking gets in the way of the therapeutic process of personal change. Once we start expanding our awareness to find solutions to our problems, we can start to venture into the darker spaces of our mind that have been storing those suppressed feelings. At this point, it's common to start clinging on to something that's beyond our control, such as blame for something that's external to us. This is our mind's protection mechanism to shield us from the overwhelm of vulnerable feelings once the nothing part of all or nothing starts to flood in. The reality is that the vulnerable feelings hiding in those darker spaces have accumulated because we've spent a long time numbing, avoiding, or distracting ourselves from them rather than learning how to handle them. Ironically, it's in those darker blind spots where the solutions to our problems are actually hiding. The key to exploring those areas with clarity is to learn how to think rationally by separating the reality of the situation from the way it feels. In the following lessons, I'm going to show you a simple method which, in the privacy of your own mind, you can learn to practice separating the reals from the feels, thus beginning the process of shining light on the areas which were previously hidden in darkness.